There are moments in life when you discover that your name has been spoken in rooms you have never entered. Conversations have unfolded in the quiet hours of the night, under dim lights and guarded tones, and somehow you were the subject. Your choices, your silence, your strength, your difference. You were not present, and yet you were there more vividly than anyone seated at the table. And what is more astonishing still is this: their words were not light. They carried weight. They pressed upon the heart. They stirred something so deep that one woman, hearing what was said of you, could not hold back her tears. It is a curious thing to be discussed in absence, for when men and women speak freely of someone who is not in the room, they often reveal more truth than when the subject stands before them. Masks loosen, pretenses fall. The careful politeness of daylight gives way to the honesty of midnight. And so if they talked all night about you, it was not idle chatter. It was not the shallow exchange of passing interest. No one spends the whole night speaking of what is trivial. The length of the conversation betrays the weight of the matter. But why you? That is the question that unsettles both you and them. For there are many names in the world, many faces in the crowd, many souls walking quietly through their days. Yet yours has stirred something restless in the hearts of others. Perhaps it is because you refused to bend when bending would have been easier. Perhaps it is because you held your peace when others demanded a reaction. Perhaps it is because there is about you a certain gravity, a presence that cannot be dismissed even when ignored. When they spoke of you, they were not merely recounting events. They were wrestling with meaning. Your life, whether you intended it or not, has become a mirror. And mirrors are uncomfortable things. They do not flatter, they reveal. In speaking of you, they were in truth confronting themselves. Your courage exposed their compromise, your patience unsettled their haste, your quiet endurance rebuked their loud complaints. And so the conversation stretched on, circling back again and again to the same question: how did they become this way? There is something profoundly unsettling about encountering a person who cannot be easily explained. We are comfortable with categories. We like to know where to place others, how to measure them, how to predict them. But you have not fit neatly into their measurements. You have confounded expectation, and when expectations crumble, the mind labors to rebuild them. Thus the long night of discussion. And what of the woman who cried? Tears are not always born of sorrow alone. Sometimes they spring from recognition. Sometimes they fall because truth has finally been spoken aloud. Perhaps as they recounted your trials, your resilience, the unseen battles you fought without applause, something in her broke. Not in despair, but in awakening. It is possible that she saw, in the telling of your story, the cost of misunderstanding you. It is possible she realized that what was once dismissed as pride was in fact integrity. What was once called distance was in truth discernment. What was once labeled stubbornness was actually conviction. There is a peculiar loneliness in being chosen, not chosen in the sense of favoritism, but chosen in the sense of being set apart. To be set apart is not always to be celebrated. Often it is to be scrutinized. Often it is to be questioned, analyzed, even resisted. Those who carry something uncommon rarely find themselves fully understood by the common gaze. Yet it is precisely this difference that compels attention. If they spoke all night, it is because your existence challenges a comfortable narrative. You remind them that excuses are thinner than they appear. You remind them that growth requires pain. You remind them that there is a standard higher than convenience, and reminders of this kind are not easily dismissed before dawn. You may not have sought such attention. You may have wished for a quieter path, one where your name did not echo in conversations beyond your hearing. But influence is not always a matter of intention. It is often the natural consequence of authenticity. When a person chooses truth over approval, consistency over applause, something rare begins to form, and rarity draws discussion. Consider this carefully. If their words were strong enough to bring tears, then your life is not insignificant. Indifference does not provoke emotion. Only that which touches the heart can move it to weep. Whether those tears were of regret, admiration, conviction, or awakening, they testify to one unassailable fact: you matter more than you have been told, and so while you slept, perhaps unaware, your story was unfolding in the minds of others. Your choices were being weighed. Your character was being examined, not because you demanded it, but because you embodied something they could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. There is power in such a life, though it is a quiet power. It does not shout, it endures. It does not seek the spotlight, it becomes the subject nonetheless. To be spoken of in the night is no small thing. The night strips away distractions. It leaves only honesty and whatever truths cannot be avoided. If your name survived those hours, if it filled them, then understand this: you carry a significance that reaches farther than you see, deeper than you feel, and stronger than you know. There is something profoundly revealing about the way people speak when the hour grows late and the world has grown tired of its own noise. In the daytime, words are often dressed carefully. They are made polite, trimmed of their sharper edges, and sent out with rehearsed smiles. But when midnight approaches and the lamps burn low, conversation sheds its costume. What remains is not performance, but confession. And it was in such an hour, unguarded and unadorned, that they spoke of you. It was not a passing mention. It was not the casual repetition of rumor. Your name did not drift lightly across the table only to disappear into the air. No, it settled there. It lingered. It returned again and again, as though the room itself refused to move on. For when people speak all night about one soul, it is not because that soul is ordinary. It is because something about that life resists dismissal. You must understand what this means. People do not wrestle with what is insignificant. They do not spend precious hours analyzing what poses no challenge to their understanding. If they circled around your decisions, your silence, your strength, it is because those things disturb their comfortable explanations of the world. You have become, perhaps without intending to, a question mark in the middle of their certainty. There are individuals who blend easily into the scenery of life. They adapt quickly, speak as expected, bend where bending is convenient. Such people rarely become the subject of midnight reflection. But then there are others, those who carry within them a quiet refusal to conform to what is shallow. These are the ones who unsettle a room simply by remaining steady. These are the ones about whom conversations stretch long after the chairs grow uncomfortable. When they spoke of you, they were not merely recounting events. They were trying to interpret them. Why did they respond that way? How did they endure so much without breaking? Why do they remain so calm when others would have retaliated? These are not questions born of idle curiosity. They are the questions of people confronted with a standard they did not expect. You see, when someone chooses integrity over approval, it exposes the fragility of those who have chosen approval over integrity. When someone stands firm in conviction, it quietly challenges those who have learned to drift. Your life, in its persistence, has become a silent argument. And arguments, even silent ones, demand engagement. Perhaps they debated your motives. Some may have suggested you were proud. Others may have insisted you were merely distant. A few might have defended you, pointing out that what appears as coldness from afar may in truth be discipline. In every long conversation there are divisions. But what unites them is this: none could ignore you. It is an uncomfortable thing to realize that someone you once underestimated has grown beyond your assumptions. It is humbling to admit that the person you thought would falter has instead flourished under pressure. And humility is rarely embraced quickly. It must be wrestled with. That wrestling often takes place in the quiet hours, when pride grows weary and truth presses harder against the conscience. And then there were the tears. One woman, hearing your story unfold in its full weight, could not contain her emotion. Perhaps she had misjudged you. Perhaps she had spoken carelessly in the past, unaware of the depth of your struggle. Or perhaps she simply saw, for the first time, the cost of your endurance. Tears are often the soul's recognition of something it can no longer deny. Consider what must have been said to move her so deeply. They may have recounted the nights you stood alone, the burdens you carried without complaint, the betrayals you absorbed without retaliation. They may have realized that your silence was not weakness but restraint, that your distance was not arrogance but protection. When truth is finally spoken aloud, it can strike the heart with startling force. There is a sacred quality to being discussed in such a way, not because it feeds the ego, but because it confirms that your life has weight. Influence is not always loud. It does not always announce itself with applause. Sometimes it is measured in the seriousness with which others consider you when you are absent. You may not have known that your quiet persistence was being observed. You may have believed your efforts went unnoticed, your growth unseen. But nothing genuine remains entire. Why hidden? Character has a way of revealing itself, even when its bearer remains silent, and when it does, it demands recognition. Their long conversation was, in truth, an admission. It admitted that you have become something they must reckon with. It admitted that you cannot be reduced to old labels. It admitted that your path has diverged from theirs in ways that provoke reflection. Whether they intended it or not, they were acknowledging your transformation. There is power in that kind of acknowledgement. Not the power of control, but the power of presence. You have become present in rooms you never entered, present in minds that once dismissed you. That is not accident. It is the natural consequence of a life lived with deliberate conviction. And so, as the night stretched on and voices grew softer, one thing became undeniable. You are no longer the person they once thought you were. Your growth has rewritten their narrative. Your steadiness has unsettled their assumptions. And in the quiet confession of midnight, they were forced to confront the simple, unembellished truth. You matter, and they know it. There is a peculiar burden that accompanies being misunderstood, especially when the misunderstanding is shared quietly among many. It is one thing to be opposed openly, it is another to be interpreted incorrectly in rooms where you have no voice. And yet, in that long night of conversation, something shifted. For as they continued to speak of you, their tone began to change. What may have started as speculation slowly turned into examination, and examination into revelation. At first they tried to explain you away. It is the natural instinct of the human heart to reduce what it does not comprehend. If someone rises above expectation, we are tempted to attribute it to luck. If someone remains calm under strain, we call it indifference. If someone refuses to retaliate, we assume weakness. These are comfortable conclusions because they allow us to remain unchanged. But the longer they spoke of you, the less those explanations satisfied them. They began recounting specific moments, the time you were overlooked, yet did not protest, the time you were criticized yet did not crumble, the time you were tempted to respond sharply yet chose restraint. Each memory, when laid out plainly, resisted the simpler interpretations. Patterns emerged. Patterns of patience, of discipline, of quiet strength. And patterns are difficult to dismiss. One voice in the room may have said, "Perhaps they are just guarded." Another may have replied, "No, there is something deeper. Guarded people grow bitter. They have not grown bitter." And so the discussion moved from surface judgments to deeper questions. What kind of person absorbs injustice without becoming unjust? What kind of soul endures isolation without becoming resentful? It was here that the conversation turned inward. For once your character could no longer be reduced, it became a mirror. Those who spoke of you began, perhaps unconsciously, to measure themselves against the standard your life presented. And this is rarely comfortable. To recognize goodness in another is to confront its absence or its immaturity within oneself. There is a subtle but profound difference between reacting and responding. Many live their lives reacting to circumstances, to opinions, to slights and praises alike. Reaction is immediate and unexamined, but response is deliberate. It passes through conviction before it becomes action. As they reflected on your choices, they began to see that you have not been merely reacting. You have been responding, carefully, thoughtfully, sometimes painfully. One of them may have remembered a moment when you could have exposed someone's failure but chose silence instead. Another may have recalled how you continued your work diligently even after recognition was given elsewhere. These memories accumulated, forming a portrait they had not expected to see. It was not the portrait of pride or aloofness. It was the portrait of restraint and resilience. And then came the realization that your silence had never been emptiness. It had been strength under control. Silence, when chosen deliberately, is not absence, it is discipline. It is the refusal to let impulse dictate destiny. And such discipline is rare. It requires an inner life hat is rich enough to withstand outer misunderstanding. As this understanding dawned, the mood in the room shifted. What began as analysis became admiration, reluctant at first, then undeniable. For admiration often follows understanding. Once people perceive the cost of another's integrity, they cannot easily return to dismissiveness. They begin to see the sacrifices hidden beneath composure. It was perhaps at this moment that the woman wept. Not because you had harmed her, but because she saw clearly what she had failed to see before. She may have realized that your distance was not rejection, but protection of your peace. She may have recognized that your refusal to engage in petty conflict was not superiority, but maturity. Tears often come when illusion gives way to clarity. To be truly seen is a rare experience. Most are seen only in fragments, judged by isolated incidents or filtered through assumption. But in that extended conversation, your life was examined as a whole. The fragments were connected, the isolated moments were placed in context, and in that context, your consistency became evident. Consistency is one of the quietest forms of power. It does not announce itself loudly, yet it shapes perception steadily. A single act of patience may be dismissed, but patience repeated over time becomes character. A single refusal to retaliate may be called coincidence, but repeated restraint becomes conviction. They began to see that what they once considered occasional was, in fact, habitual. And habit reveals the heart. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became that your life has been guided by something beyond convenience. You have chosen the harder path more than once. You have endured misunderstanding without demanding immediate correction. You have allowed time to defend you, rather than rushing to defend yourself. Such choices require trust in truth, trust in growth, trust that what is genuine will endure. As dawn approached, they could no longer speak of you lightly. The weight of evidence was too great. Your life had confronted their assumptions and quietly overturned them. Some may have felt regret for words spoken in haste. Others may have felt inspired, challenged to examine their own responses to hardship. What they discovered in that long night was not merely who you are, but what you represent. You represent the possibility of maturity in a culture of reaction. You represent steadiness in an age of impulse. And once such a possibility is seen, it cannot be unseen. In the end, their conversation became less about explaining you, and more about understanding themselves in light of you. And that is perhaps the most profound influence one life can have. Not to dominate a room, but to elevate its reflection. There comes a moment in every honest reflection when admiration alone is no longer sufficient, when those who have spent hours discussing another must finally confront the deeper implication of what they have discovered. For it is one thing to acknowledge strength in someone else, it is another to accept what that strength requires of you. As their conversation continued, it moved beyond who you are and began to press upon who they have been. Recognition carries responsibility. Once they saw that your restraint was not weakness, they could no longer excuse their own impatience. Once they understood that our silence was discipline, they could no longer glorify their impulsive words. The image they had formed of you began to stand quietly in contrast to their own habits. And contrast, when it is sharp enough, demands a decision. Some may have resisted this inward turn. It is far easier to keep analyzing another than to examine oneself. They might have attempted to return to safer ground, revisiting old stories, reinterpreting your motives in a way that diminished the challenge. But the longer they spoke, the less convincing those efforts became. Truth, once glimpsed, has a way of persisting. They remembered moments when you were provoked publicly and yet answered privately. They recalled times when you absorbed criticism without broadcasting your defense. In each memory, there was a pattern of self-mastery. And self-mastery is unsettling to those who have not cultivated it. It exposes the restless places within the human heart, the need to be validated, to be right, to be seen. Perhaps someone in that room admitted reluctantly that they had misjudged you. Perhaps another confessed that they had spoken carelessly, mistaking your calm for indifference. Such admissions are not small. They require humility, and humility rarely arrives without discomfort. Yet discomfort is often the doorway to growth. The woman who wept may have felt this most keenly. Tears are not only a response to pain, they are often the soul's response to awakening. In hearing your story told in its fullness, she may have recognized her own haste in forming conclusions. She may have realized that while she was measuring your tone, she had not considered your burden. While she was evaluating your distance, she had not understood your discipline. There is something sacred about being misunderstood, and yet remaining unchanged in character. Many alter themselves in response to misperception. They grow louder to counter accusations of silence. They grow harsher to counter accusations of weakness. But you did not bend to correct every narrative. You allowed time to reveal what argument could not. And this patience, now examined in hindsight, appeared almost formidable. As the night deepened, the conversation likely turned toward motive. Why would someone choose the harder path so consistently? They may have asked. Why not defend themselves more aggressively? Why not demand recognition? These questions reveal more about the questioner than the subject, for they assume that comfort and applause are the highest aims. Your life has quietly suggested otherwise. To live by conviction rather than convenience is to accept solitude at times. It is to endure being spoken of without being present to clarify. It is to trust that integrity, though slow to be acknowledged, is never wasted. This kind of living cannot be improvised in a moment. It is forged in private decisions long before they become public patterns. And here lies the deeper truth that began to unsettle them. Your strength was not accidental. It was cultivated. It was chosen repeatedly, often, when no one was watching. The calm they witnessed was not temperament alone, but discipline refined through trial. Once this became clear, admiration could no longer remain casual. It carried with it a quiet rebuke. For if strength can be cultivated, then weakness is not inevitable. If patience can be practiced, then impatience is not merely personality. Your life, in its steadiness, challenged the comfortable belief that this is simply how I am. It suggested that character is shaped by decisions, not dictated by impulse. Some in that room may have felt inspired. They may have resolved, silently, to reconsider their own reactions, to speak less quickly, to listen more deeply. Others may have felt defensive, unwilling to relinquish familiar habits. But none could leave the conversation entirely untouched. Once a life has been examined so thoroughly and found consistent, it leaves an imprint. And what of you, unaware of this long deliberation? You continued as you always had, choosing restraint, maintaining focus, guarding your peace. You did not know that your name had filled the night, that your story had drawn tears, that your character had stirred self-examination. Yet this is often how true influence operates, unseen, unannounced, yet undeniably present. By the time the first light of morning hinted at the horizon, something in that room had shifted permanently. They could no longer reduce you to old labels. They could no longer speak of you lightly. The narrative had changed, not because you defended yourself, but because your life had defended you. In the end, what they confronted was not merely your growth, but the possibility of their own. Your example stood quietly before them, not demanding imitation, but inviting it. It asked a question without words. What might you become if you chose discipline over impulse, patience over pride, conviction over convenience? And that question lingered long after the conversation ended. By the time the night had surrendered to morning, the conversat. Ion had done more than reinterpret your character. It had altered the atmosphere of those who took part in it. For there is a peculiar power in sustained reflection. When a name is spoken long enough with seriousness, it ceases to be mere sound and becomes symbol. And somewhere between the first casual remark and the final heavy silence, you had become more than a person in their discussion. You had become a measure. A measure does not shout, it does not accuse, it simply stands, steady and unmoving, while others recognize how far they themselves have drifted. This is what your life had become in that room, not an object of gossip, but a quiet standard against which choices were now being weighed. It is no small thing to become such a reference point, especially without intending to. They may not have said it directly, but the realization would have been unmistakable. you have been living with intention. In a world that moves hurriedly, reacting to every slight and chasing every affirmation, you have moved differently. You have paused where others rushed. You have withheld where others unleashed. You have endured where others abandoned. And endurance, when sustained over time, acquires a kind of authority. Authority of this kind is not granted by title or applause. It is earned in private battles, battles of temper, of doubt, of loneliness. Those who listen to your story unfold may have begun to sense that your calm exterior concealed many unseen wars. The restraint they once misread as distance now appeared as victory. Victory over impulses that would have been easier to obey. It is easy to admire strength when it is dramatic, when it bursts forth in visible triumph. But your strength was quieter than that. It showed itself in consistency, in the refusal to retaliate, in the discipline of speech, in the decision to grow rather than to grow bitter. Such strength does not demand attention, yet it commands respect when noticed. As the conversation drew toward its end, there was likely a lingering stillness. Words had done their work. The room may have felt heavier, not with hostility but with awareness, for awareness has weight. Once they saw you clearly, they could no longer return to the comfort of misunderstanding. Clarity had replaced assumption, and clarity requires adjustment. Some adjustments would be internal, a reconsideration of how quickly they judge, a recognition that silence does not equal emptiness, an admission that resilience is often mistaken for coldness by those who have not cultivated it. These are subtle changes, yet they mark the beginning of maturity. Other adjustments might be relational. Perhaps they resolve to speak of you differently. Perhaps they determine to approach you with greater care, no longer interpreting your boundaries as rejection. It is possible that the tears shed that night softened more than one heart. Tears have a way of washing pride from the eyes, allowing one to see without distortion. But beyond their transformation lies a deeper truth about you. You did not orchestrate this reckoning. You did not campaign for vindication. You did not demand that your name be cleared or your motives defended. Instead, you continued living according to your convictions, trusting that truth, though slow, is steady. And in time, truth found its way into that room without your presence. There is a profound lesson here about influence. Influence is not always the result of visibility. It is often the result of integrity. When a life is aligned internally, when actions consistently reflect principles, that life generates gravity. Others feel it, even if they cannot immediately explain it. They discuss it. They wrestle with it. They are changed by it. You may never know the full extent of what was said. You may never hear the confessions that followed, or see the private resolutions that were formed. Yet the impact remains real. The conversation did not end when the voices faded. It continued inwardly, echoing in thoughts long after morning arrived. And this is the quiet triumph, not that they talked all night about you, but that by the end of that night, they were no longer merely talking about you. They were confronting themselves. Your life had become a catalyst for reflection. Your consistency had unsettled complacency. Your growth had exposed stagnation, not through accusation but through example. To live in such a way is to accept a certain solitude. Those who carry steady conviction are often observed before they are understood. They are analyzed before they are appreciated. Yet if they remain faithful to what is true, appreciation eventually replaces analysis. Respect replaces suspicion. And sometimes, as in that room, tears replace careless words. Morning came, as it always does. The chairs were emptied. The conversation dissolved into separate paths. But something invisible remained, a shift in perception, a softening of judgment, a recognition of strength. Your name, once spoken lightly, now carried weight. And you, perhaps unaware, continued forward, not to prove anything, not to correct every narrative, but to remain who you have chosen to become. For the greatest vindication is not found in being defended by others, but in being consistent with oneself. In the end, the night did not elevate you through flattery. It elevated you through understanding. And understanding, once earned, is far more enduring than praise. What they did not expect, as the night gave way to day, was that the conversation about you would not fade with their fatigue. Some discussions evaporate with sleep. They belong only to the mood of the hour. But this one clung to them. It followed them into the morning light, into their routines, into the quiet spaces between tasks. For when truth unsettles a person deeply enough, it refuses to remain confined to a single room. You had become, in their minds, a living contradiction to many of their assumptions. They had believed strength required noise. You proved it could be silent. They had believed influence required visibility. You demonstrated it could grow in obscurity. They had believed that being misunderstood demanded immediate correction. You showed that patience can accomplish what argument never could. As the day unfolded, each of them likely carried a fragment of the night's realization. One remembered your composure in a moment when they themselves had lost control. Another recalled your refusal to participate in gossip that would have elevated you at someone else's expense. Another thought of the way you continued to build quietly, even when applause was directed elsewhere. These memories, once scattered and insignificant, had now formed a coherent testimony. There is something transformative about seeing a life as a whole rather than in isolated moments. When they once viewed you in fragments, they could dismiss you. A single silence was labeled distance, a single boundary was labeled pride, a single refusal was labeled stubbornness. But when those moments were placed side by side, a pattern emerged that could no longer be trivialized. The pattern spoke of discipline, of clarity, of purpose. And purpose unsettles those who drift, for many live by reaction, moved by the latest opinion, the nearest pressure, the most immediate emotion. But you have moved by conviction. Conviction is quieter than impulse, yet infinitely stronger. It does not flare and vanish, it endures and shapes. And as they reflected on this, they began to sense the cost of such living. Conviction requires sacrifice. It demands that you forfeit certain comforts, the comfort of quick approval, the comfort of easy retaliation, the comfort of blending in. They began to understand that your solitude was not rejection but refinement, that your distance at times was not coldness but protection of focus, that your refusal to explain yourself endlessly was not arrogance but security. Security does not scramble to be understood. It trusts that time and consistency will speak. Perhaps some of them felt a quiet shame, not a destructive shame but a clarifying one. The kind that whispers, "You could have been more patient, you could have looked deeper, you could have asked before assuming." This kind of shame does not condemn, it awakens. It marks the beginning of a new way of seeing. And so the effect of that long night was not merely emotional, it was moral. It shifted the standard by which they measured strength. No longer could they equate loudness with power or defensiveness with courage. You had redrawn the lines without ever intending to. Your life had become evidence that another way is possible. There is a profound mystery in this, that one person, by quietly mastering themselves, can alter the internal landscape of many others. You did not deliver a speech in that room. You did not defend your record. You were not present to influence tone or emphasis, and yet your absence was filled with presence. The integrity you practiced in private had traveled farther than your voice ever could. In time, some of them may approach you differently. They may listen more carefully. They may speak more thoughtfully. They may even confess what they once misunderstood. Others may never voice their realization aloud, but even silence can carry respect when it has been earned. And what of you? You may continue unaware of the full weight of that night. You may still wonder whether your restraint is seen, whether your growth is noticed, whether your quiet endurance matters. But understand this: nothing lived with integrity is ever wasted. Even when hidden, it is working. Even when unacknowledged, it is shaping perception. The true significance of that night was not that they talked about you until dawn. It was that by dawn, they could no longer speak of you carelessly. Your name had acquired gravity. Your story had demanded reverence. And reverence is not given lightly. There will always be rooms where you are discussed. Some will misunderstand. Some will speculate. But there will also be rooms like that one, where after long examination truth rises gently yet firmly, and hearts are softened by recognition. In those rooms tears may fall again, not from sorrow but from clarity. You were never meant to chase approval. You were meant to cultivate character. And character, once matured, defends itself more eloquently than any argument. It stands in your absence. It speaks when you are silent. It corrects narratives without your intervention. So let them talk if they must. Let your life continue its steady course, for in the end, what endures is not the noise of opinion, but the quiet authority of a soul aligned with its convictions. And that authority, once revealed, cannot easily be dismissed.